June 15th, 1961, 2:47 p.m. The scorching Harlem sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked sidewalks of 125th Street, casting long shadows that seemed to whisper secrets of a neighborhood that had seen too much pain, too much struggle, yet never enough justice. Margaret Johnson, 73 years old and moving with the careful dignity of someone who had weathered 7 decades of America's harsh realities, stepped out of Johnson's Market with nothing more threatening than a paper bag containing bread and milk. For 40 years this had been her ritual. The same store, the same gentle smile for Malik, the young man who always held the door, the same slow, measured steps toward the tenement building she'd called home since 1925, when Harlem still pulsed with the promise of the Renaissance, and before the neighborhood learned that dreams could be systematically crushed by the weight of institutionalized hatred. Margaret Johnson carried herself with the quiet grace of a woman who had raised a son in these unforgiving streets, who had watched him grow from Ellsworth, the boy with quick hands and quicker wit, into something the newspapers called a crime boss, but she simply called her child. She knew what people whispered about her son's business. She knew about the respect his name commanded, the fear it inspired, the power it wielded. But in her heart he was still the young man who sent her flowers every Sunday and made sure she never wanted for anything. What Margaret Johnson didn't know was that 6 blocks away, police officer Daniel "Mad Dog" McKenzie was having the worst day of his 34 years on this earth, and he was about to make it hers. McKenzie sat in his patrol car, uniform crisp despite the heat, badge gleaming like a badge of authority he'd never truly earned. His hands gripped the steering wheel with the white-knuckled intensity of a man whose world was crumbling around him. His wife Sarah had left him 3 days ago, taking their 8-year-old daughter and leaving behind only a note that cut deeper than any knife. "I can't watch you become the monster you've become, Danny. Don't follow us." The gambling debts were piling up faster than his police salary could cover them. Vinnie Torino's boys had been asking questions about when they'd see their money, and the kind of questions Vinnie's boys asked usually preceded the kind of answers that left people in hospital beds, or worse. McKenzie needed to feel powerful today. He needed to remind himself that he wore the badge, that he had the authority, that in this city of 8 million people there were still some who had to respect him whether they wanted to or not. That's when he saw her. An elderly black woman, moving slowly down 125th Street, minding her own business just like thousands of other people did every day in New York. But to Mackenzie's twisted perspective, warped by years of prejudice and a childhood in rural Alabama where his father had taught him that some people were worth less than others, she represented everything he could control when the rest of his life was spinning out of control. Margaret Johnson had no way of knowing that she was about to become the catalyst for one of the most legendary acts of justice Harlem had ever witnessed. She couldn't have predicted that her quiet dignity in the face of hatred would spark a response that would redefine the balance of power between the police and the community for decades to come. All she knew was that she wanted to get home, put away her groceries, and maybe sit by her window to watch the children play in the street below. Officer McKenzie stepped out of his patrol car. The sound of his car door slamming shut cut through the ambient noise of Harlem like a gunshot. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. In a neighborhood where police presence was rarely a sign of protection and often a harbinger of trouble, people had learned to read the signs. The way McKenzie moved with the aggressive swagger of someone looking for conflict rather than maintaining peace sent warning signals through the crowd. Malik, who had just finished helping Mrs. Rodriguez with her heavy groceries, noticed first he'd seen enough police interactions to recognize when an officer was hunting rather than serving. The way McKenzie's hand rested casually near his service weapon, the way his eyes had locked onto Margaret Johnson with predatory focus, the way he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed his badge made him untouchable. It all added up to trouble. "Ma'am?" McKenzie called out, his voice carrying the particular tone that law enforcement officers used when they wanted to establish dominance from the very first word. "Ma'am, I need you to stop right there." Margaret Johnson paused. Her groceries clutched against her chest. In her 73 years, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense danger, and every instinct she possessed was screaming at her now. She turned slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements that could be misinterpreted, and faced the police officer with the dignified composure that had carried her through decades of navigating a society that too often saw her as less than human. "Yes, officer," she replied, her voice steady, despite the fear beginning to crawl up her spine. "Is there something I can help you with?" McKenzie approached with deliberate slowness, each step calculated to intimidate. He was close enough now that Margaret could see the angry red veins in his eyes, could smell the stale coffee on his breath, mixed with something sharper, alcohol, even though it was barely 3 in the afternoon. This was a man on the edge, and Margaret Johnson had become his target. "What's in the bag?" McKenzie demanded, nodding toward her groceries. "Bread and milk, officer. I just finished shopping." Margaret's response was polite, respectful. Everything that 40 years of living in Harlem had taught her it needed to be when dealing with hostile police officers. "Bread and milk?" McKenzie repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "At this time of day? Where'd you get the money for that bread and milk, Grandma?" The word grandma came out like an insult, loaded with contempt and racial undertones that made several people in the gathering crowd wince. Margaret felt the familiar sting of disrespect, the casual dehumanization she'd experienced countless times throughout her life, but she maintained her composure. "I have my pension, officer. I worked for 30 years as a seamstress. I earn my money honestly." "Honestly?" McKenzie laughed, a harsh, grating sound that contained no humor whatsoever. "You people don't know what honest work means. You live off the system, off welfare, off whatever you can steal or con out of decent, hard-working Americans." The crowd was growing larger now. Word spread quickly in Harlem when police were harassing residents, and people emerged from stores, apartments, and parked cars to witness what was unfolding. Among them were faces that Margaret recognized: Mrs. Williams from the church, old Mr. Peterson who ran the barber shop, young mothers with children who looked on with a mixture of fear and anger. What none of them knew was that less than 10 blocks away, in the back office of a legitimate dry cleaning business that served as the headquarters for the most sophisticated criminal organization in Manhattan, someone was about to receive a phone call that would change everything. "Officer," Margaret said, her voice beginning to carry a slight tremor not of fear but of barely controlled anger. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years. I've never been arrested, never been in trouble with the law. I'm just trying to go home." "Home?" McKenzie stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. "You mean that rat-infested building where you people breed like cockroaches? That's what you call home?" The crowd stirred uneasily. This had crossed the line from routine police harassment into something much uglier. Malik, who had been watching from the doorway of the market, made a decision. He slipped inside and headed for the payphone behind the counter, his hands shaking as he dialed a number that every person in Harlem knew by heart, even if most would never dare to use it. Margaret Johnson drew herself up to her full height, all 5 feet and 3 inches of her, and looked directly into Mackenzie's eyes. For 73 years, she had endured slights, insults, and degradations with grace and dignity. She had bitten her tongue when white employers treated her like furniture, had swallowed her pride when store clerks followed her around as if she were a criminal, had remained silent when bus drivers looked through her like she was invisible. But standing there on 125th Street, holding a bag of groceries she'd bought with money she'd earned through decades of honest labor, something inside Margaret Johnson finally reached its breaking point. "Officer," she said, her voice steady but carrying steel underneath, "I am not you people. I am Mrs. Margaret Johnson. I am a human being with dignity and rights, and I will not stand here and allow you to speak to me this way." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Mackenzie's face flushed red with rage and something else. Surprise. He wasn't accustomed to elderly black women standing up to him. In his experience, they cowered, apologized, and hurried away. This woman was doing none of those things. "Did you just mouth off to me?" Mackenzie snarled, his hand moving instinctively toward his nightstick. "Did you just disrespect a police officer?" "I showed you more respect than you've shown me," Margaret replied. "And I've done nothing wrong except try to walk home with my groceries." That's when Mackenzie lost whatever tenuous grip he'd maintained on his professionalism. That's when a routine police interaction became something much darker. That's when he reached for the weapon that racists had wielded against black Americans for centuries, not a gun or a nightstick, but a word. A single word that carried the weight of 400 years of oppression, hatred, and dehumanization. And that's when Margaret Johnson, for the first time in her 73 years, heard that word directed at her with the full force of institutional authority behind it. The word hit the gathered crowd like a physical blow. Conversations stopped entirely. Children who had been playing nearby fell silent. Even the traffic on 125th Street seemed to pause, as if the city itself had drawn a sharp breath. Margaret Johnson's composure, maintained through 7 decades of navigating American racism, finally cracked. Not into tears, not into fear, but into something much more dangerous. Cold, righteous anger. "Don't you dare call me that word," she said, her voice carrying across the street with surprising power. "Don't you dare." McKenzie smiled then, a cruel expression that revealed the true depths of his hatred. "I'll call you whatever I want to call you. You're in my city, on my beat, and you'll show me the respect I deserve." Respect is earned, officer. It's not demanded. The simple truth of those words seemed to infuriate McKenzie even further. He grabbed Margaret by the shoulder, his fingers digging into her thin frame with enough force to make her wince. The bag of groceries fell from her hands, bread and milk scattering across the sidewalk in a stark metaphor for the dignity that was being trampled underfoot. "Pick it up," McKenzie ordered. Margaret looked down at her scattered groceries, then back up at the police officer. "Pick it up." "No. You knocked it down. You pick it up." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, might have escalated into physical violence, might have ended with Margaret Johnson in handcuffs or worse. But at that moment, a black Cadillac pulled up to the curb with the smooth silence of expensive engineering. The car door opened, and Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stepped onto 125th Street. At 56 years old, Bumpy Johnson was still an imposing figure. 6 feet tall and 200 pounds of lean muscle, he carried himself with the casual confidence of a man who had never backed down from a fight and never lost one that mattered. He wore a tailored charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than McKenzie made in 6 months. And when he moved, it was with the fluid grace of someone who had learned long ago that survival often depended on being faster, smarter, and more dangerous than everyone around you. But it wasn't his physical presence that made the crowd part before him like water. It wasn't the expensive clothes or the unmistakable aura of wealth and power that surrounded him. It was something much simpler and much more terrifying. The absolute certainty in his eyes that he was capable of anything, and that nothing in the world would stop him from protecting what was his. McKenzie, still gripping Margaret's shoulder, turned to see who had caused the sudden hush that had fallen over the street. When his eyes met Bumpy's, something cold and predatory passed between them. The recognition of 2 apex predators who had just found themselves in the same territory. "Take your hands off my mother," Bumpy said quietly. The words were spoken without anger, without aggression, without any emotion at all. They were simply a statement of fact, delivered with the calm certainty of someone announcing that the sun would rise in the east tomorrow morning. But everyone who heard them understood the threat contained within that quiet voice. McKenzie's hand dropped away from Margaret's shoulder, as if he'd been burned. He knew exactly who he was facing now. Every police officer in Manhattan knew the name Bumpy Johnson. He was the man who had gone toe-to-toe with Dutch Schultz and lived. The man who had earned respect from Lucky Luciano himself. The man who controlled more of Harlem than the mayor of New York controlled of his own city. Your mother," McKenzie stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating like steam. Bumpy didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to Margaret and gently helped her gather the scattered groceries. His movements tender and careful in sharp contrast to the dangerous energy that radiated from every line of his body. When he had collected the last item, he handed the bag to his mother and kissed her forehead with infinite tenderness. "Mama," he said softly. "Are you hurt?" Margaret shook her head, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Not of pain, but of humiliation and rage. "I'm fine, Ellsworth, but this man," he called me. She couldn't bring herself to repeat the word. Bumpy's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around him. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The casual conversations that had been resuming among the crowd died away again. Even the pigeons that had been pecking at crumbs near the market entrance took flight. "What did you call her?" Bumpy asked, turning his attention back to McKenzie. Officer McKenzie tried to summon some of his earlier authority, but facing Bumpy Johnson was a different proposition entirely from harassing an elderly woman. This was a man who had built an empire on the principle that respect was not requested but demanded, and that disrespect was met with swift and terrible consequences. She was being disrespectful to a police officer. McKenzie managed to say, "I asked what you called her." The repetition of the question carried weight. McKenzie understood that he was being given one chance to answer honestly, and that his response would determine what happened next. But McKenzie had spent too many years believing that his badge made him untouchable, that the power of the state stood behind even his worst impulses. "I called her what she is," McKenzie said, trying to inject some of his earlier venom into the words. The crowd held its collective breath. Margaret Johnson closed her eyes, and Bumpy Johnson smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a shark that had just caught the scent of blood in the water. It was the smile of a chess master who had just seen his opponent make the exact wrong move. It was the smile of a man who had just been given justification to do something he was very, very good at. "Officer." Bumpy paused, reading the name tag. "McKenzie, you just made the biggest mistake of your life." What happened next on 125th Street would become the stuff of legend in Harlem, passed down through generations like a folktale that perfectly captured the moment when institutional racism met organized resistance. But to understand the full scope of what Bumpy Johnson accomplished that day, you have to understand that this wasn't just about a son protecting his mother. This was about a community that had endured decades of systematic oppression, finally finding a voice powerful enough to demand justice. Bumpy Johnson looked at Officer McKenzie for a long moment, his dark eyes calculating possibilities with the speed of a man who had survived 40 years in the most dangerous game imaginable. Around them, the crowd had grown to nearly 50 people, all watching with the kind of breathless attention usually reserved for prize fights or natural disasters. They sensed they were witnessing something historic, though none of them could have predicted just how far-reaching the consequences would be. "You know what, Officer McKenzie?" Bumpy said finally, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "I could kill you right here, right now, in front of all these witnesses. And there wouldn't be a thing the New York Police Department could do about it." McKenzie's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, but Bumpy held up a single finger, a gesture so commanding that the police officer actually froze mid-motion. "But see, that would be easy. Too easy. And easy doesn't teach lessons. Easy doesn't create change. Easy doesn't make sure that what happened to my mother today never happens to anybody else's mother." Margaret Johnson looked at her son with a mixture of pride and concern. She had seen Ellsworth handle problems before, but never with this particular combination of cold fury and calculated precision. She recognized something in his demeanor that reminded her of when he was 12 years old and had systematically destroyed the reputation of a teacher who had humiliated him in front of his classmates. Not through violence, but through pure strategic thinking. "So here's what's going to happen instead," Bumpy continued, beginning to pace in a small circle around McKenzie, like a predator sizing up its prey. "You're going to learn what it feels like when the system turns against you. When every door closes. When every friend disappears. When every comfort you've taken for granted suddenly becomes unavailable." Officer Jim Patterson chose that moment to make his appearance, pulling up in a second patrol car with his sirens wailing. Patterson was McKenzie's partner, a 38-year-old veteran of the force who had learned early in his career that looking the other way when McKenzie abused his authority was easier than filing reports that would never be taken seriously anyway. But Patterson was also smart enough to recognize when a situation had spiraled beyond anyone's control. He stepped out of his car with his hand on his weapon, but when he saw Bumpy Johnson standing calmly in the center of the crowd, his tactical training kicked in. This wasn't a situation that could be resolved with show of force. This was politics, and politics in Harlem meant treating carefully around certain individuals who wielded power that didn't come from badges or uniforms. Johnson, Patterson said, his voice carrying a respectful tone that McKenzie had never bothered to master. What seems to be the problem here? The problem, Officer Patterson, Bumpy replied, is that your partner just called my 73-year-old mother a racial slur in front of 50 witnesses after physically assaulting her for the crime of walking home with groceries. Patterson's face went pale. He had known McKenzie for 6 years, had watched him abuse his authority countless times, but this was different. This wasn't some teenager they could rough up and intimidate into silence. This was Margaret Johnson, and everyone in Harlem knew that hurting Bumpy Johnson's family was tantamount to signing your own death warrant. "McKenzie," Patterson said quietly, "tell me you didn't actually—" "I handled a disrespectful civilian," McKenzie interrupted, trying to project confidence he no longer felt. "That's what we're paid to do." Patterson closed his eyes for a moment, recognizing that his partner had just destroyed both of their careers. When he opened them again, he was looking directly at Bumpy with an expression of genuine regret. "Mr. Johnson, I apologize for my partner's behavior. This is not how the NYPD conducts business." "Yes, it is," Bumpy replied calmly. "This is exactly how the NYPD conducts business. Every single day. The only difference is that today, you picked the wrong woman to disrespect." What happened next would be analyzed in police academies, criminal justice courses, and sociology textbooks for decades to come. Bumpy Johnson demonstrated something that most people in 1961 believed was impossible: that institutional power could be challenged and defeated not through violence or revolution, but through superior organization, strategic thinking, and the careful application of pressure at exactly the right points. "Malik," Bumpy called to the young man who had been watching from the market doorway. "You still got that camera your cousin gave you?" Malik nodded, producing a small Kodak camera from his jacket pocket. "Take pictures of these officers. Make sure you get their badge numbers clearly, and get a good shot of my mother's torn dress where Officer McKenzie grabbed her." The click of the camera shutter seemed to echo unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. McKenzie and Patterson exchanged glances, both recognizing that documentation changed everything. This wasn't just going to be a he-said, she-said situation that would disappear into the bureaucratic machinery of the police department. "Mrs. Williams," Bumpy continued, addressing an elderly woman in the crowd who was known throughout the neighborhood for her perfect memory and unimpeachable character. "You saw everything that happened here today, didn't you?" "Every word, every action," Mrs. Williams replied firmly. "I heard that officer use language that no Christian person should ever use, especially not to a woman of Mrs. Johnson's standing. Mr. Peterson, you witnessed Officer McKenzie physically assault my mother, saw him grab her shoulder hard enough to tear her dress," the barbershop owner confirmed. "Saw him knock her groceries to the ground on purpose." Within minutes, Bumpy had orchestrated something unprecedented in 1960s police interactions. A fully documented incident with multiple credible witnesses, photographic evidence, and a clear chain of events that could be verified by anyone who cared to investigate. But documentation was only the first step in what would become the most sophisticated act of nonviolent resistance Harlem had ever witnessed. "Officer McKenzie," Bumpy said, turning his attention back to the increasingly nervous police officer, "you made a choice today. You chose to see my mother as something less than human. You chose to use your badge as license for hatred. You chose to represent everything that's wrong with the relationship between law enforcement and the community you're supposed to serve." McKenzie tried to interrupt, but Bumpy held up a hand for silence. "Now I'm going to make some choices. I'm going to choose to show you what accountability looks like. I'm going to choose to demonstrate that actions have consequences. And I'm going to choose to make sure that every police officer in this city understands that respect for our community is not optional." Bumpy reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notebook and a gold fountain pen. He began writing quickly, his handwriting precise and deliberate. When he finished, he tore out the page and handed it to Malik. "Take this to Commissioner Williams. Tell him it's from me. Tell him I expect a response within 24 hours. The note contained a simple message: "Your Officer McKenzie badge #4471 racially abused my mother Margaret Johnson today at 2:47 p.m. on 125th Street, in front of 50-plus witnesses with photographic documentation. We can handle this through proper channels or through my channels. You have 24 hours to decide which you prefer. Me, Johnson. What made this approach so revolutionary was that Bumpy was offering the police department an opportunity to police itself, something that rarely happened in cases of racial abuse. He was essentially saying you can discipline your own officer, or I will discipline him for you. But one way or another, discipline will occur. While Malik hurried off to deliver the message, Bumpy turned his attention to the crowd that had gathered. These weren't just random spectators anymore. They had become witnesses to something that might change the fundamental power dynamic between their community and the police force that was supposed to protect them. "Friends and neighbors," Bumpy said, his voice carrying clearly across the street. "What happened to my mother today happens to somebody in this community every single day. The only difference is that today, we have the power to do something about it." He gestured toward McKenzie and Patterson, who were standing uncertainly beside their patrol cars, unsure whether to leave, make arrests, or call for backup. These officers represent a system that sees us as less than human. A system that believes badges give them the right to humiliate our mothers, our daughters, our wives, and our children. A system that operates on the assumption that we have no power to fight back. The crowd murmured agreement, but Bumpy wasn't finished. That assumption ends today. Not with violence, not with destruction, but with organization, with unity, with the kind of strategic action that creates lasting change. What Bumpy Johnson understood, and what made him such a formidable figure, was that real power didn't come from the ability to hurt people. It came from the ability to make systems work for you instead of against you. Over the next several hours, he would demonstrate this principle with devastating effectiveness. The first phone call went to Detective Lieutenant Frank Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the force, who owed Bumpy several significant favors from back when Bumpy's information had helped Morrison solve a series of high-profile cases. Morrison listened to Bumpy's account of the incident and immediately understood the implications. "Jesus," Bumpy Morrison said over the phone. "McKenzie's got a reputation, but this is bad even for him. You got witnesses? 50 of them. Plus photographs. Plus a torn dress. Plus whatever internal affairs investigation you boys feel like conducting. What do you want?" "I want McKenzie transferred out of Harlem, tonight. And I want a formal apology to my mother from the department." "That's not going to be easy. McKenzie's got friends." "Morrison." Bumpy's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more threat than any shout could have. "My mother is 73 years old. She's never been arrested, never been in trouble, never done anything but live quietly and mind her own business. Today, one of your officers called her the worst word in the English language and put his hands on her in front of half the neighborhood. I'm offering you a chance to handle this professionally. Don't make me handle it personally." The second call went to Councilman Robert Hayes, the highest-ranking black elected official in Manhattan, and a man who had been trying to build bridges between the police department and Harlem residents for years. Hayes had been waiting for exactly this kind of documented case. Something so clear-cut and well-witnessed that even the most racist police administrators would have trouble ignoring it. "Bumpy, if what you're telling me is accurate, this could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for," Hayes said. "But I need those witnesses to go on record officially. They'll talk to whoever you send. But Hayes, this doesn't drag out for months in committees and investigations. I want action now. Give me 48 hours. You have 24. The third call was the most important, and it went to Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., the most powerful black politician in America, and a man who had never been afraid to take on the establishment when civil rights were at stake. Powell had been looking for a high-profile case that could demonstrate the ongoing problems with police brutality in urban communities. "Ellsworth," Powell said, "after listening to the account, this is exactly the kind of systematic abuse we've been documenting. With your permission, I'd like to make this a federal case." "Do whatever you need to do, Congressman. Just make sure it doesn't happen again." But while Bumpy was working the political angles, He was also implementing a more direct form of pressure that would hit McKenzie and Patterson where they lived. Within 6 hours of the incident, on 125th Street, every bookie, numbers runner, and small-time entrepreneur who owed Bumpy Johnson favors had received very specific instructions. McKenzie and Patterson's photographs were distributed to every bar, restaurant, grocery store, gas station, and shop owner in a 20-mile radius of Manhattan. The message was simple: these officers harass elderly black women. Your business will be much better served by refusing to serve them. The economic boycott was total and immediate. When McKenzie tried to stop for coffee on his way home that evening, the diner owner apologetically informed him that they were all out of everything. When Patterson attempted to buy gasoline, the station attendant claimed the pumps were broken. When both officers tried to get dinner at their usual restaurant, the hostess explained that they were fully booked despite dozens of empty tables. But the economic pressure was only one component of Bumpy's strategy. The fourth call had gone to Tony Torino, a mid-level figure in the Italian-American organized crime families who had a profitable working relationship with Bumpy's organization. Torino controlled several legitimate businesses, including a construction company that did regular work for the city. "Tony, I need you to make some inquiries about Officer Daniel McKenzie. Personal finances, gambling debts, family situation, anything that might be interesting." Within hours, Torino called back with information that would prove devastatingly useful. McKenzie owed $8,000 to illegal gambling operations, money he had borrowed when his marriage was falling apart and he was drinking heavily. The loans were being carried by people who were connected to people who did business with people in Bumpy's network. A single phone call changed McKenzie's manageable gambling debt into an immediate crisis that required payment in full within 48 hours. The psychological pressure began that same evening. McKenzie arrived at his apartment to find his landlord waiting with an eviction notice. The building had been sold, the new owners explained, and all current leases were being terminated. He would need to find new accommodations within 30 days. Patterson discovered that his wife had been approached by investigators who were asking questions about his finances, his associations, and whether he had ever been involved in any questionable police activities. The investigators were polite, professional, and absolutely terrifying in their implications. But perhaps the most effective pressure came from within the police department itself. Commissioner Williams received Bumpy's note at 6:30 p.m., and by 7 p.m. he was in emergency meetings with the department's senior staff, the mayor's office, and the district attorney's office. Everyone understood that this wasn't just about one officer's racism, this was about the department's entire relationship with Harlem, which was already strained to the breaking point. Internal Affairs Detective Sarah Murphy was assigned to conduct an immediate investigation. Murphy was known throughout the department as someone who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or convinced to look the other way. When she interviewed the 50 witnesses that Bumpy had organized, she discovered something unprecedented: a completely consistent account of police misconduct from people who had no reason to lie and every reason to fear retaliation. By 10 p.m. that same evening, McKenzie was in Commissioner Williams' office, receiving what would later be described as career guidance. "Danny," Williams said, his voice tired and resigned, "you've been a problem for this department for years. We've overlooked your attitude, your methods, your complete lack of judgment. But this time you picked the wrong target." "Commissioner, I was just doing my job." "Your job is to serve and protect. You called a 73-year-old woman a racial slur and physically assaulted her for walking home with groceries. That's not police work. That's thuggery." Williams slid a transfer order across his desk. "You're being reassigned to the 42nd Precinct in the Bronx, effective immediately. If I hear one single complaint about your conduct there, you'll be looking for a new career." But McKenzie's humiliation was far from over. The next morning, newspapers across New York carried the story. The New York Times ran it on page 3. Harlem Incident Highlights Police Community Tensions. The Amsterdam News, Harlem's leading black newspaper, made it front-page news. Elderly woman abused by racist officer. Community demands justice. But it was the photographs that made the story unforgettable. Malik's pictures showed Margaret Johnson's torn dress, the scattered groceries, and McKenzie's face twisted with hatred as he grabbed an elderly woman's shoulder. The images were so powerful that they were picked up by newspapers across the country, becoming a symbol of everything that was wrong with race relations in urban America. Congressman Powell used the incident as the centerpiece of a speech on the House floor about the need for federal oversight of local police departments. When a 73-year-old woman cannot buy bread and milk without being subjected to racial abuse by the very officers sworn to protect her, we have failed as a society, Powell declared. The speech was broadcast on national television and reprinted in newspapers from coast to coast. Margaret Johnson, who had never wanted anything but to live quietly in her neighborhood, found herself at the center of a national conversation about civil rights, police accountability, and the dignity of Black Americans. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was what didn't happen in the weeks and months following the incident. Police officers throughout Manhattan, and particularly those assigned to predominantly Black neighborhoods, found themselves operating under much closer scrutiny. The Margaret Johnson incident had demonstrated that abusive behavior would no longer be tolerated or ignored. Community organizations began documenting police interactions more systematically. Political leaders started taking complaints more seriously. And most importantly, residents realized that they had more power than they had previously understood. McKenzie's transfer to the Bronx lasted exactly 6 months. His new commanding officer, Captain Rodriguez, had been briefed about the circumstances of his reassignment and made it clear that any repeat of his Harlem behavior would result in immediate termination. McKenzie, thoroughly humbled and genuinely fearful for his career, actually became a competent police officer for the first time in his life. But his real education came from an unexpected source. 3 months after his transfer, McKenzie was assigned to investigate a break-in at a small grocery store in a predominantly Puerto Rican neighborhood. The store owner, Mrs. Esperanza Gonzalez, was 68 years old and reminded him powerfully of Margaret Johnson. When McKenzie found himself automatically assuming that she was somehow involved in insurance fraud, he caught himself and realized how deeply ingrained his prejudices had become. For the first time in his adult life, McKenzie actually listened to Mrs. Gonzalez's account of the break-in, treated her with respect, and conducted a thorough investigation that resulted in the arrest of the actual perpetrators. The grateful store owner invited him to dinner with her family, and McKenzie experienced something he had never felt before: the satisfaction of actually serving his community rather than oppressing it. It would be overly optimistic to say that McKenzie became a champion of civil rights overnight, but the Margaret Johnson incident had fundamentally changed his understanding of what it meant to be a police officer. He completed his career in the Bronx without a single formal complaint, retiring with a modest pension and the respect of his colleagues. Patterson's story took a different trajectory. The stress of the incident, combined with the investigation and media attention, led to a nervous breakdown that required 6 months of medical leave. When he returned to duty, he requested a transfer to desk work, saying he no longer felt comfortable in patrol situations. He eventually became a competent administrator who specialized in community relations, a role that suited his naturally apologetic temperament. Margaret Johnson lived for 7 more years after the incident, during which she became something she had never sought to be: a symbol of dignity in the face of hatred. Civil rights organizations invited her to speak at rallies and conferences. Politicians sought her endorsement. Journalists wanted to interview her about her experiences growing up in the South and raising a family in Harlem. But Margaret's most important role was much simpler than any of those public appearances. She became the living reminder that every person, regardless of age, race, or economic status, deserved to be treated with basic human respect. Her story was told and retold throughout Harlem, becoming part of the neighborhood's oral history and a source of inspiration for anyone who faced discrimination. When Margaret Johnson died in 1968, her funeral was attended by over 3,000 people, including the mayor of New York, Congressman Powell, and dozens of police officers who came to pay their respects to a woman who had taught them what community policing really meant. Bumpy Johnson delivered the eulogy for his mother, and his words captured the essential meaning of what had happened on 125th Street 7 years earlier. "My mother never wanted to be a symbol or a civil rights pioneer," he said. She just wanted to walk home with her groceries in peace. But when that peace was shattered by hatred, she showed all of us what real strength looks like. Not the strength to hurt others, but the strength to maintain your dignity when others try to strip it away. Not the strength to seek revenge, but the strength to demand justice. My mother taught this community that we don't have to accept disrespect as the price of survival. We can demand better, and we can organize to make sure we get it. The Margaret Johnson incident became a foundational moment in the development of community policing strategies that would be adopted by urban police departments across the country. It demonstrated that accountability could be achieved without violence, that community pressure could be more effective than political protest, and that real change required both moral courage and strategic thinking. But perhaps most importantly, it established a principle that would guide Harlem's relationship with law enforcement for generations. Respect was not a privilege to be granted by those in authority, but a right to be demanded by those who deserved it. The 73-year-old woman who had simply wanted to buy bread and milk had inadvertently started a revolution. Not with guns or riots, but with the simple insistence that her humanity be recognized and respected. And in the end, that quiet revolution proved more powerful and more lasting than any act of violence could have been.